The pristine white tiles of the Mount Sinai VIP surgical wing were never meant to be stained with the blood of a kingpin. Zora Sterling stood in the center of the darkened operating room 4, the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator the only sound against the backdrop of distant, screaming sirens. She was scrubbed in, her hands steady, but she wasn't waiting for a surgical team. She was waiting for the man who had just collapsed through the service entrance, clutching a side that was leaking crimson onto his custom-tailored charcoal suit. Hyun Park, the man who had supposedly retired from the underworld to become a tech saint, looked less like a god and more like a ghost. His eyes, usually sharp enough to cut glass, were unfocused and glazed with pain. As Zora caught him, the sheer weight of his muscular frame nearly sent them both to the floor. "I told you," Hyun gasped, his voice a jagged rasp that tore through the sterile air. "I told you to forget. My name, Zora." "Shut up and breathe, Hyun," Zora hissed, her professional mask cracking as she ripped open his silk shirt, exposing the intricate dragon ink now slick with blood. Her fingers flew to the specific nerve cluster on his abdomen, the secret spot she had spent months healing. Only now it wasn't just a site of old trauma, it was the entry point for a high-caliber round. She pressed her palm against the wound, the heat of his blood soaking through her surgical gloves. Outside, the heavy thud of combat boots echoed in the hallway. The Elder Council hadn't just sent a message, they had sent a cleanup crew. "They're coming for the ledger," Hyun whispered, his hand catching her wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. "It's inside you, Zora, the research. The chip. They'll kill you to get it." Zora looked at the door, then back at the man she had brought back from the brink of death once before. She leaned down, her forehead pressing against his. "5 years ago, I taught you how to feel again," she whispered fiercely. "Today, I'm going to teach you how to survive. Please don't stop fighting. Because if you die, the dragon dies with you, and I'm not ready to let go yet." As the handle of the OR door began to turn, Zora didn't reach for a scalpel to heal. She reached for the emergency lockout lever, her eyes turning from a nurse's mercy to a protector's rage. The healing was over. The war had begun. Welcome back to the channel, besties. Before we dive into the story, if you are new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Now let's proceed with the story. The transition from the blood-slicked concrete of Seoul to the glass and steel serenity of Manhattan was supposed to be the end of the nightmare. For 6 months, life had been a series of quiet triumphs. Zora Sterling had established her private neurospecialist clinic in a limestone townhouse on the Upper East Side, her reputation as the woman who healed the glacier of Seoul, bringing her an influx of elite, high-paying clientele. Beside her, Hyun Park had successfully pivoted into the role of a tech philanthropist, his sharp edges softened by the expensive sweaters and the domestic peace of their shared penthouse overlooking Central Park. But peace, Zora was beginning to realize, was a fragile commodity for a man who had once been a dragon. The first sign of the shift was subtle, a phantom itch in the back of her mind that she couldn't quite scratch. It started on Monday with her 10 o'clock appointment. The patient was a man named Mr. O, a middle-aged executive who complained of chronic nerve pain in his shoulder. He sat on her examination table, his posture too rigid, his eyes scanning the room with a clinical precision that had nothing to do with medical anxiety. When Zora reached out to test his reflexes, she noticed the faint, jagged scar on his forearm, the kind of mark left by a tactical knife, not a kitchen accident. He didn't flinch when she applied pressure. He simply watched the door. On Wednesday, a shipping magnate from Busan arrived with a supposed spinal tremor. As Zora reviewed his MRI, she realized the man wasn't listening to her diagnosis. Instead, he was staring at the reflection of the hallway in the polished chrome of her desk lamp. When her assistant, a bubbly girl named Sarah, entered the room, the man's hand went instinctively to the small of his back, a movement so practiced and lethal that Zora's heart skipped a beat. It was the draw of a man reaching for a holster that wasn't there. By Friday, the air in the clinic felt heavy, charged with a static that Zora recognized all too well from the darkened hallways of Di Hyun's Seoul fortress. Her final patient of the day was a young man with a shaved head and a tailored suit that couldn't quite hide the bulk of his shoulders. He claimed to have migraines, but when Zora asked him to track her light with his eyes, he didn't focus on the beam. He focused on the window, his pupils dilating as a black SUV idled at the curb outside. "Is there something outside more interesting than my exam, Mr. Kang?" Zora asked, her voice cool, though her pulse was hammering against her ribs. The man looked at her, his expression a blank mask of professional indifference. "New York is a dangerous city, Dr. Sterling. It is important to know who is watching the exits." Zora finished the exam in a blur of mechanical efficiency. After he left, she stood in her darkened office, the city lights beginning to flicker to life outside. She looked at her schedule for the week. 6 patients, all of them Korean, all of them physically fit, hyper-aware, and bearing the invisible marks of soldiers. They weren't patients seeking a cure, they were sentries providing a perimeter. She wasn't just a doctor anymore. Her clinic had been turned into a safe house, and her patients were a rotating guard of lookouts for the Seoul Syndicate. The ghost dragon hadn't just moved to New York. He had brought the underworld with him, tucked neatly into the shadows of her professional life. Zora grabbed her coat, her hands trembling as she locked the heavy oak doors of the clinic. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she noticed the same black SUV from earlier. The driver didn't look away when she stared. He simply nodded, a sign of respect or perhaps a warning. She hailed a cab, her mind racing. Di Hyun had promised her that the violence was over. He had promised that they were legitimate. But as the taxi pulled away, she saw 2 other cars pull out of their parking spots to follow her. The healing was a lie. The New York ghost was still a kingpin, and Zora realized with a sickening jolt that she wasn't just his partner. She was the most valuable asset in a war that had never actually ended. The heavy thud of Zora's shoulder against the marble kitchen island was a stupid, domestic accident, the kind of clumsy stumble that only happens when your mind is 3 blocks away. She had been reaching for a wine glass, her thoughts still tangled in the suspicious eyes of Mr. Kang, when her silk slipper lost its grip. The pain was sharp, a white-hot spike that radiated from her collarbone down to her ribs. "Zara!" Di Hyun was across the room in a blurred streak of motion, his hands hovering over her with that frantic, terrifying tenderness he only showed when she was hurt. "Don't move. Let me see." "I'm fine, Di Hyun. It's just a bruise," she gasped, waving him off as she clutched her shoulder. But as the night wore on, the dull ache sharpened into something more sinister, a grinding sensation that suggested a hairline fracture. By midnight, with Di Hyun finally asleep and the penthouse bathed in the rhythmic pulse of the city's neon, Zora couldn't take it. As a doctor, the uncertainty was worse than the pain. She dressed quietly, slipped out past the security detail in the lobby who didn't even blink at her 1:00 a.m. departure, and drove herself to her clinic. She didn't need a technician. She knew how to calibrate her own equipment. The clinic was silent, the air smelling of ozone and lavender. Zora stepped behind the lead-lined shield of her private imaging suite and positioned the X-ray arm over her left clavicle. She pressed the trigger. The machine hummed, a brief burst of invisible energy passing through her skin, and the digital monitor flickered to life. Zora leaned in to examine the bone structure, looking for the telltale shadow of a break. She found it, a minor stress fracture, but her breath caught for an entirely different reason. Located just beneath her collarbone, nestled in the soft tissue near the brachial plexus, was an object that shouldn't have been there. It was microscopic, a tiny, rectangular sliver of high-density synthetic material that glowed with a distinct, unnatural sharpness on the scan. It was microencapsulated, shaped like a grain of rice, and shielded in a way that would make it invisible to standard airport scanners. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the hollow silence of the room. She remembered her own surgery 6 months ago, the emergency procedure to remove shrapnel after the White Tiger Syndicate's last desperate attack in Seoul. Hyun had insisted on his private medical team. He had been there when she went under the anesthesia. He had held her hand until the darkness took her. He hadn't just saved her, he had used her. She zoomed in on the image, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the desk. This was no medical device. This was the ledger. The fabled digital vault containing the offshore accounts, the political bribes, and the true identities of every council member in Asia. It was the secret spot evolved, a biological key hidden in the one person the world would never think to search. The realization felt like a physical violation. The man who had whispered that she was his sanctuary had turned her body into a safety deposit box for his sins. He hadn't just brought the underworld to New York. He had sewn it into her very marrow. "You promised," she whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking. "You promised no more secrets." She stared at the screen, the glowing chip looking like a parasite on her skeletal frame. The lookouts at her clinic, the black SUVs, the patients with tactical scars, they weren't there to protect a retired boss. They were there to protect the hardware. They were guarding her like a piece of equipment. A soft click echoed from the front of the clinic. The heavy oak doors had opened. Zora froze, her eyes darting to the security monitor. A shadow moved across the lobby, not the hurried, heavy gait of a thief, but the silent, predatory glide of a man who knew exactly where he was going. She reached for the power button on the X-ray monitor, plunging the room into darkness just as the handle to the imaging suite began to turn. In the shadows, the tiny fracture in her bone seemed to throb in time with a betrayal in her heart. The healer had been marked by the dragon, and the price of his protection was her own autonomy. The betrayal felt heavier than the chip in her bone as Zora slipped back into the penthouse, the silence of the luxury apartment now feeling like the interior of a gilded cage. She found Hyun standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette a dark rift against the sparkling New York skyline. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. "You went to the clinic," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the glass. "I went to get an X-ray," Zora replied, her voice trembling with a cold, sharp fury. "Imagine my surprise, Hyun, when I found out I'm carrying more than just a fracture. I found your secret spot. Only this time, it's digital." Hyun turned, his expression a mask of tortured stoicism. "Zora, I did it to ensure." The rest of his sentence was swallowed by the sudden, muffled thump of a window breaching in the master's suite. The pressurized seal of the penthouse had been broken. Before Zora could scream, Hyun was a blur of motion, lunging across the room to tackle her behind the heavy velvet sofa, just as a volley of suppressed gunfire shredded the air where she had been standing. "The council," Hyun hissed, pulling a handgun from a hidden holster beneath the coffee table. "They aren't waiting for a negotiation." Two men in matte black tactical gear vaulted over the balcony, their movements professional and synchronized. They weren't there to kill, they moved with the intent to capture. They wanted the ledger, and they knew exactly which body it was hidden in. Hyun fired, catching the first man in the shoulder, but the second assassin deployed a flashbang. The world turned into a blinding, white roar. Zora felt the floor drop out from under her, her medical instincts screaming through the panic. She saw Hyun struggle to rise, his vision blurred, his movements sluggish from the concussive force. One of the assassins lunged for her, reaching for the very collarbone that held the chip. Zora didn't scramble away. Instead, she leaned into the attacker's reach. In her hand was a pressurized canister of sevoflurane, a potent inhalation anesthetic she had taken from the clinic, and a surgical syringe filled with a concentrated neuromuscular blocker. As the man grabbed her arm, Zora drove her thumb into the carotid sinus, a specific pressure point at the fork of the carotid artery. The sudden stimulation caused his heart rate to plummet and his blood pressure to drop instantly, a reflex known as carotid sinus syncope. As he stumbled, Zora pressed the canister's nozzle directly beneath his tactical mask. The sweet, chemical scent of the gas filled the air. Within seconds, the assassin's grip loosened, his nervous system bypassed by a dose of sleep he hadn't prepared for. Di-Hyun, left side, Zora shouted, ducking as another shadow loomed over her. Di-Hyun, recovering his senses, used the sofa as a springboard, launching himself at the second attacker. But the man was larger, a brute who pinned Di-Hyun against the glass wall. Zora saw the man's hand go for a combat knife. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled across the floor, driving the syringe into the large muscle of the attacker's thigh. "Succinylcholine," she whispered, her voice shaking but her hands precise. The drug worked with terrifying speed. The assassin's muscles began to fasciculate, small, involuntary twitches rippling under his skin, before they went completely limp. It was a total paralysis of the skeletal muscles. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, his eyes wide and terrified, fully conscious, but unable to move even a finger to finish his kill. Di-Hyun stood over the fallen men, his chest heaving, his eyes darting to Zora. He looked at the syringe in her hand, then at the two elite soldiers she had neutralized with nothing but biology and nerves. For the first time, he saw her not as the woman he needed to protect, but as the only person capable of keeping him alive. "We have to go," he said, his voice thick with a mix of shame and awe. "The perimeter is gone. They know the ledger is active." Zora stood up, wiping a smear of soot from her forehead. She looked at the man she loved, the man who had turned her into a target. "We're going," she agreed, her voice hard as diamond. "But we're doing this my way. No more ghosts, Di-Hyun. From now on, the dragon follows the doctor." The private jet banked sharply over the dark, churning waters of the Korea Strait, the lights of Jeju Island appearing as a jagged emerald necklace against the black velvet of the sea. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was suffocating, thick with the smell of copper and the electric hum of the plane's medical monitors. Di-Hyun sat in a leather captain's chair, his face a mask of sweating marble. He hadn't spoken since they cleared New York airspace, his gaze fixed on a point in space that only he could see. Zora knelt at his feet, her hands moving over his legs with a frantic, clinical rhythm. "Di-Hyun, I need you to push back, just a little. Give me a sign that the signals are still reaching your motor cortex." He didn't move. He couldn't. The trauma of the penthouse breach had acted like a master switch, flipping his nervous system back into the frozen state that had defined his life for 5 years. It was the ultimate betrayal of his own mind, a psychosomatic collapse triggered by the sudden, violent return of the world he thought he had escaped. The secret spot on his abdomen, the old injury site that had been the epicenter of his healing, was now throbbing with a phantom pain that bypassed all medication. "It's happening again," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "The ice! Zora, it's coming up from my feet. I can't feel the floor." "It's a conversion disorder, Di-Hyun. Your brain is trying to protect you from the stress by shutting down the machinery," Zora explained, her voice forced into a calm she didn't feel. She knew the science. Under extreme emotional duress, the amygdala can override the motor pathways, creating a physical paralysis that is very real to the patient despite the lack of a new physical injury. She watched the needle on his heart rate monitor climb. They were landing in 10 minutes at a private airstrip on the southern tip of the island, a fortress disguised as a luxury villa. But a fortress was a tomb if its king couldn't stand. As the wheels touched down with a jarring thud, Di-Hyun's head fell back against the headrest. His breathing was shallow, his pupils blown wide with a primal, paralyzed terror. The ghost dragon was gone, replaced by the broken man she had met in that Seoul penthouse months ago. "They're waiting for us at the villa, aren't they?" Zora asked as she signaled for the transport team. "The Elder Council. They have eyes everywhere," Di-Hyun managed to choke out. "If they see me like this, they won't even negotiate, they'll just harvest." Zora's blood ran cold. She knew what he meant. They didn't need Di-Hyun alive, they just needed the chip inside her and the key that was coded to his unique neural signature. If he couldn't function, they would take what they wanted from both of them with a scalpel. She leaned in close, her lips brushing his ear, her hand pressing firmly against the secret spot to ground him. Listen to me. I didn't pull you out of the darkness just to let you slide back in. We are going into that villa, and you are going to hold your head high, even if I have to be the one holding up your heart. The ice doesn't win today. The cabin door hissed open, admitting the humid, salt-tinged air of Jeju. Two of Di-hyun's most loyal remaining men stood at the bottom of the ramp, their faces grim. Zora didn't wait for them to help. She draped Di-hyun's heavy, limp arm over her shoulder, her knees buckling for a moment under his weight, and began the agonizing process of dragging her king toward a sanctuary that felt more like a trap. The dragon had fallen, and as the humid night swallowed them, Zora realized she wasn't just his nurse or his lover anymore. She was his only armor in a world that had finally scented his weakness. The subterranean medical bunker beneath the Jeju villa was a cathedral of cold steel and flickering monitors, a stark contrast to the tropical warmth of the island above. Di-hyun lay strapped to a reclining biomechanical chair, his body as rigid as a tombstone. The psychosomatic paralysis had reached his diaphragm, making every breath a shallow, hitching struggle. Outside, the perimeter sensors were already screaming. The Elder Council's fleet was moving in, silent as sharks in the moonlit water. Di-hyun, look at me, Zora commanded, her voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. She was holding two specialized electrodes, wired to an experimental neurostimulator she had smuggled from her New York clinic. Your brain has locked the gates. I have to blow them open. This isn't going to feel like healing. It's going to feel like fire. He couldn't nod. He could only stare at her with eyes full of a drowning man's desperation. Zora positioned the first probe at the base of his skull and the second directly over the secret spot on his abdomen, the scarred epicenter of his trauma. I'm increasing the frequency, she whispered, her hand hovering over the dial. I need your nervous system to override the fear block. I need you to scream if you have to, but please don't stop fighting to find my hand. She thumbed the switch. A jagged arc of high-frequency electricity surged through Di-hyun's frame. His back arched violently, his muscles seizing in a forced tetanic contraction. A guttural, primal sound tore from his throat, a cry of pure, unadulterated agony as the machine forced his dormant nerves to fire. Again, Zora cried, tears blurring her vision as she watched the man she loved writhe under the artificial lightning. On the monitor, the flat line of his motor-evoked potentials began to spike into chaotic, jagged mountains. She was essentially jump-starting his soul. The pain was the only thing sharp enough to pierce the thick ice of his conversion disorder. She saw his fingers twitch, not a reflex, but a conscious, agonized clawing at the air. Zora, stop, he gasped, the words barely audible over the crackle of the electrodes. I can't, she sobbed, pushing the dial into the red. If I stop now, the gates will permanently close. Stay with me. Feel the pain, Di-hyun, use it. The bunker shook as the first of the council's breaching charges detonated at the villa's upper gates. The ceiling dusted them with white plaster. They were out of time. Zora leaned over him, her face inches from his, the smell of ozone and sweat filling the narrow space. She grabbed his hand, pressing her palm against his. Find me, Di-hyun. Break the ice or we die here. With a final, explosive surge of current, Di-hyun's eyes flew open, the pupils constricting with a sudden, lethal focus. His hand suddenly clamped onto hers with a bone-crushing grip. The paralysis didn't just fade, it shattered. He sat bolt upright, ripping the electrodes from his skin, his chest heaving as the ghost dragon roared back to life within the shell of the broken man. The door to the bunker groaned under the weight of a thermal cutter. Di-hyun stood, his legs trembling but holding, his gaze settling on the rack of tactical gear in the corner. He looked at Zora, the pain still radiating through his limbs, but the frozen stare was gone. The fire worked, he said, his voice dropping into that terrifying, melodic vibration of the high-ranking predator. He reached out, his thumb catching a tear on her cheek. Now, give me the syringe. I have a debt to settle before the sun rises. Zora handed him the adrenaline auto-injector, her heart racing. The healer had done her job. She had awakened the monster to save the man. As the bunker door began to glow red from the outside heat, she knew the sanctuary was gone. The dragon was awake, and he was hungry. The smell of ozone from the neurostimulator was quickly replaced by the acrid stench of melting thermite. The bunker door didn't just open, it disintegrated. Before the smoke could clear, a wave of Elder Council enforcers flooded the room. Di Hyun, still reeling from the shock of his forced awakening, managed to neutralize the first two with a brutal, visceral efficiency, but his legs, still weak from the paralysis, betrayed him. He stumbled, and in that split second of vulnerability, a heavy rifle